Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me for my talk on Metadata for Everyone, which is a project by the Public Knowledge Project with support from Crossref. My name is Julie, and I'll be discussing metadata quality issues across cultures. As the title suggests, our project engages with metadata through cultural lenses to ask if metadata is in fact for everyone. As we know, metadata has the potential to make global research visible and accessible for immediate and wider audiences in our global scholarly ecosystem. The key phrase there being has the potential, because we also know that creating metadata and enhancing records to meet quality standards requires lots of time and labor. And for some, this requires a much larger investment of time and labor than for others. And this is in part because many of our technical systems and standards for metadata, whether that's for creating, editing, sharing, ingesting, or parsing metadata, are built around the English language and Western ideas of knowledge and scholarly practice. On the ground, this looks like setting English language metadata as an inclusion criteria for indexing in Scopus and the Web of Science, assuming Latin scripts and left-to-right directionality when designing user interfaces, or limiting geographic identifiers to ISO-approved lists that do not include Indigenous nations and contested regions. So while metadata will ideally make research from all regions and cultures more visible and accessible, the reality is that our tools and mechanisms make it more difficult for certain communities to share, find, and access relevant information. And when systems and standards impose meanings that aren't appropriate or relevant, they are failing their users. It's important to note that metadata does not just support resource description and discovery in the scholarly ecosystem either. For researchers, quality metadata helps to build their professional identity and corpus through name disambiguation and co-location of their work, and also expand their research communities and networks through co-location along disciplinary and theoretical lines. The quality and diversity of research undertaken is also strengthened by quality metadata that broadens discovery, sharing, and use for topics both in and out of the mainstream, and amplifying voices and perspectives that are often marginalized due to systemic biases. With evaluation processes still relying heavily on metrics and citations like the H-index and impact factors, metadata quality also directly impacts review, promotion, and tenure outcomes. So given these implications, and given that PKP and Crossref are organizations that create systems for managing scholarly metadata, we were interested in understanding how metadata quality, consistency, and completeness impact individuals and communities. Specifically, we embarked on this project to understand which identities are erased or obscured in metadata, even when standards are perfectly applied. The scholarly ecosystem is also a global one, and we wanted to see how well our current metadata systems capture this global dimension. And where systems and standards can fall short, we're interested in the idiosyncratic ways that individuals use metadata to assert or retain their identity. To explore these questions, the project began with an initial discovery phase between PKP and Crossref to establish scope and priorities and identify data sources. During phase 1, we used the Crossref API to pull a data set from the identified sources, and I manually reviewed the records to surface culturally related issues and establish a typology of common issues. This typology has informed work in phase 2, which is using programmatic methods to measure metadata quality based on the presence of these issues on a much larger scale. So how does one identify cultural issues in metadata quality? We start with the question of what is metadata quality, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we determine that it is a multidimensional concept. Much of the literature, though, focuses on what we might call technical quality, things like the informational completeness and accuracy of the record, in conformance to standards and controlled vocabularies for usability by humans and machines alike. As you may have guessed, technical quality is not the focus of our study. Instead, we're interested in issues of cultural quality and the ways in which individuals and communities actively seek to convey meaning and express identity through metadata. And so for this project, we measured quality against the possibility of harm or disservice that an aspect of the metadata could cause to a person or group in their work. More formally, we define cultural issues as issues that impact or have the potential to impact the representation of identities, roles, intentions, and other factors specific to social, regional, or research cultures. This definition is intentionally vague and broad because of the myriad ways in which culture can inflect and impact how knowledge is understood and research is conducted. To make the review manageable from a point of scale, the final sample included 427 records that were known to have technical quality issues. Since PKP maintains the Open Journal System platform, a subset of records were intentionally retrieved from journals publishing with OJS to see where improvements could be made in the software or its support. To identify the issues, I combined Marcia Zong and Jianqin's advice to examine metadata records alongside their original items with the humanities methods of close reading to surface details and differences in form and content. This involved close reading the record and comparing it to its associated item and landing page. And information about the container was also reviewed at times to determine things like language policies and publisher location. When similar issues were noted between records, I also read across records and items to see if patterns emerged. Following an initial review of 61 records to determine areas of focus, I chose to focus on the item abstract and title, a person's given and family names, as well as affiliations, and the publisher title, language, and subject for containers. And now turning to the issues themselves. In total, we identified 32 unique issues, which take on 5 main forms, those being a value being absent, values in the record not matching with either information in the item or the parameters of the field, issues with the completeness of the value, or values being incorrectly input. And as part of this review, we also wanted to see if we could easily distinguish between issues of technical quality and issues of cultural quality. In some cases, it was a relatively clear call. Footnote markers are a technical issue likely caused by copy pasting from typeset text, as in the left example, whereas inconsistent language choices, both within and across institutional affiliations in a single record, lean more toward the cultural end of the spectrum, as with the middle instance. In other cases, though, the lines are blurrier. For instance, when an author's title appears alongside their name in the given and family name field, is that similar to the footnote marker case where the first part of an author name string and the item text is copied into the given name field and the rest is pasted into the family name field, even if the full string is more than just the author's name? Or is this a deliberate choice to assert that the author's title is as significant as their name? Or is it a bit of both? Despite these gray areas, we analyzed the issues and were able to identify 6 main types of issues that often affect individual identities and cultural characteristics. And I'll briefly introduce the 6 issue types in this section. Starting with language issues that relate to the languages and scripts of values and their identification using language and style attributes, we have an example record for an item that's only available in Japanese. The record itself, though, contains values in a mixture of English and Japanese languages and Latin and Japanese scripts. And the language of the record is set to English. So this leads to questions about why this combination of languages was used and how it actually affects how the publisher, author, container, and item are understood. Issues related to naming can also overlap or stand apart from issues with language, and naming issues consider whether individual and organizational names are recorded in accordance with linguistic and cultural conventions. In our first example, we have a name in Korean input entirely in the family name field. Perhaps this is because family names are presented before given names in Korean, or perhaps there's another reason. This name structure is also standard in Chinese, but since romanizations inconsistently maintain the original naming order, family names can end up input in all caps to convey the name part to those unfamiliar with the language. And other naming conventions are common in other parts of the world. In Southeast Asia, for instance, names might include only one name part, but because both given and family name fields are required in most cases, these individuals are forced to repeat their names across the 2 fields. For organizations, naming issues often involve acronyms. In this case, the full name is translated in English, but the following acronym is based on the university's name in Bahasa Indonesian. And this university also has a name in Japanese. So what led to rendering this publisher's name in these ways? And contribution issues refer to the acknowledgement of contributors to the creation and publication of the item and its contents. So this includes authors and publishers, but also editors, rights holders, funders, and the like. In many cases, these issues resulted from the absence of some or all authors from a record, as was the case for the 2 examples on the left. The right shows an unusual instance of a record identifying the copyright holder, but this also raises the question of why the Chinese organization is referenced only in English translation, and if the assertion field is most appropriate for this information. Issues and elements that can document geographic locations, which gesture to social, cultural, and linguistic positions, fall under the geography umbrella. And those elements are generally publisher location and author affiliation. Publisher locations were recorded in very few instances. In many cases, such as with the publisher on the right, the location and context that the journal is situated in is immediately known only to those who recognize IAIN Langsa as a college in Indonesia. In the second case in the middle, the regional publishing platform Sayelo helps to signal the region that this publisher is from, but it still lacks specificity, and the acronym for the Brazilian organization likewise prevents this understanding. In both cases, we ask if the institutions are better known locally by these acronyms, and what the implications are of using acronyms versus full names. On the other hand, when we encounter multinational publishers like Elsevier on the right side, publisher names and locations won't tell us much, but author affiliations could. In many cases, though, author affiliations are also absent. Under the heading of seniority are stylistic and content-based interventions that may reflect the position of certain authors, and we saw one example of this already with the inclusion of associate professor in the given and family name fields. To the left, we have other relatively simple cases in which all authors are listed as first or all are listed as additional. In either variation, there's a suggestion of equal contributions and resistance to more hierarchical models of recognition. The right reflects a more complex situation in which the names of faculty members are recorded in all caps, while those of students are noted in regular case. A distinction that is read as intentional because of the noticeable absence of the faculty member's title in the record, unlike the earlier example. And the final issue type, prestige, often overlaps with seniority and geography and refers to issues suggesting the significance of institutional representation or reputation. And this single example presents two common issues. To the left, we have metadata for the first author. The name of this author is not given. Instead, the general name field is used to provide their title as research scholar and their institutional affiliation. To the right, we have metadata for the second author, whose name is provided. Based on the information in the original item, we determined that the assistant professor title and institutional affiliation presented in the separate following author element group is in fact the title and affiliation of the second author. And so we wonder how seniority and institutional representation or reputation interact, and in what contexts and under what conditions institutional prestige is deemed as significant as, or perhaps even more significant than, individuals conducting the research. So with all that said, what do these findings mean? With 6 main issue types found in the records in various forms, the findings confirm that metadata is in fact not for everyone. While many of the identified issues may really just result from poor metadata practice, deviations from standards or best practices should not be preemptively dismissed as issues of technical quality. It is just as possible that these issues result from deliberate acts to assert or retain cultural meanings and aspects of identity because the current systems and standards are failing to reflect user realities. Rachel Jaffe argues that metadata contribute to a story we are telling about ourselves as individuals, as organizations, and as a community. So considering this framing, what stories do our current metadata systems and standards allow for? And what stories are individuals and communities trying to tell through their interventions? More work is needed across the board, not only by metadata creators, but also by editorial boards, publishers, and technical organizations to understand and address the ways that systems and standards render communities, worldviews, and stories invisible. These issues are systemic and will take significant time and effort to change. So while not a permanent solution, local policies or mechanisms might be explored to mitigate issues that are most relevant in a given context. These issues are also not limited to the world of metadata. And we hope these findings can support and engage in broader conversations and struggles around equitable participation and homogenizing standards. There are, of course, limitations to a project like this one. For one, this project involves just one needle in the metadata haystack, and the review itself is not comprehensive. The issues and patterns found are also specific to my interpretation of the 427 records in this sample. The ability to recognize issues and nuances also often depends on familiarity with particular social, regional, and research cultures. And so there are likely things that I've overlooked or read too deeply into. As well, neither the metadata itself nor the process of close reading will tell us anything about the actual reasons behind the issues. Building relationships and having conversations to understand which issues result from poor metadata practice and which result from deliberate interventions is critical to determining what needs changing and how changes should be made. For our part, our program at Dennis is continuing this work in phase 2 of the project to explore the extent to which types of metadata issues identified in this study are actually present in a much larger sample, using computational methods and analyses to examine 100,000 records. In addition to measuring metadata quality and completeness in relation to these issues, he's also analyzing the relationship between metadata quality and completeness and facets like the language of publication, publisher size, and more. And we hope you'll stay tuned for those findings. A quick thanks to the team as well. This project wouldn't be possible without them and all the folks at Crossref who provided lots of support. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions.